Silas, it is good to see you. The last time we saw each other, you were in Knoxville for the Lark Ascending book tour, and that was a great evening. But you've got even better news with this poet laureate of the Commonwealth of Kentucky, and I'm just curious what it has felt like. I know you love Kentucky and claim it, what just has it felt like to be given this honor and this responsibility?
Well, it is. It's daunting, but it's. I do feel really honored. I'm especially glad to have been appointed by a governor I really admire and respect, and a governor who his whole platform is about empathy, and he's a man of deep faith, and he's progressive, and his first appointee as a poet laureate was a black woman named Krista Wilkinson, and his second one, me, is the first. I'm the first openly gay poet laureate of Kentucky. So he is a governor for all of us, and I appreciate that.
So, I don't know at this point if you've had much time to start traveling as the poet laureate, but I'm curious, thinking about this theme for this gathering about communities and connection and safety. What's hurting right now in
Mm.
Kentucky in the places you're traveling?
Well, I mean, it is a fraught time for LGBT people. The Human Rights Campaign just named a national state of emergency for our safety, and so that is of concern. It is something that people are thinking a lot about. Um, and I think it's one reason that it's more important to be a visible um, LGBT person who is out there as poet laureate and is out there as a writer, and who also, have a really, I like to talk a lot about being a multifaceted person. I mean, sometimes I have to say I am a gay writer, or sometimes I have to say I am an Appalachian writer, or I'm a working class writer. Uh, I'm a person of faith and a writer. So I have lots of identities, and I like to think about the intersections and not just one of those. But just like I just said, sometimes one of those takes relevance in a conversation. But I do think that being multifaceted like that and recognizing all those identities as being equal and what makes me a writer and a person helps me to, I hope, represent more people in my position as poet laureate.
I'm curious. As a person of faith, I'm aware that you've written about the rise of Christian
Mm.
nationalism. You've also written a lot about, we've all experienced also in the state of Tennessee, the way in which anti-LGBTQ matters are so held up as sort of Christian values. I'm curious how you continue to claim your Christian faith in such a difficult time.
Well, again, I'll sort of reiterate the same thing, that I think it makes it even more important to talk about that, right? Because I do sometimes feel that Christianity has been hijacked by the loudest people in the room who have politicized it. And what a terrible thing to politicize people's faith. I just think it's terribly sad that that's been done. It's been weaponized. And so it's even more important for people of faith who do not have a political agenda behind their faith to speak up and to talk about their values. And I think for me, especially, it's complex because I was raised evangelical and I was raised in a fundamentalist sect. Um, a very strict, very controlled situation. And so I feel like, my journey from being raised evangelical to wandering alone in the wilderness for some years and trying to figure myself out, holding on to my faith, and eventually feeling, taken into the arms of the Episcopal Church, um, has, those challenges to my faith have made my faith stronger. Um, and it, it, to go back just a little bit to the containing multitudes, I think what you're saying goes right into something I think a lot about is as wonderful as the internet is, and as there's so many great things about the internet, but one of the things that I think has been the most terrible about the internet is how it has compelled us to think more in absolutes and less in complexity. It's made us sort of assign people to heroes or villains, and and to sort of, if you're not easily assigned into one of those categories, you just might as well not exist. And of course, most human beings exist in that gray. We're full of all kinds of different ways of being and notions, and we're not easily categorized. And so that's something that I think, as a novelist, I think a lot about. One of my jobs as a novelist is to explore that gray. It's to explore those complexities. If I have a one-dimensional character, then I failed. But our culture increasingly assigns us into one-dimensional roles. I also think that's concerning, but I also think it makes art even more important.
I'm curious for, with the folks that are listening to you today, are there particular things you've written about place? Are there other folks who have written about place that you'd want to share with us today?
Well, I have one passage that I think anytime I'm asked that question, I always go to that passage. Um, it's pretty short. Can I read it to you?
Sure,
This is from
please.
my novel, The Cold Tattoo, which is probably the novel of mine that is the most environmentalist. It's the book of mine that is most a sort of uh, I don't know, a tribute to the land, and maybe even an elegy for the land, as I became increasingly aware of the climate crisis and things like that. But this little passage goes more to sort of the way rural people are negated and even erased from our culture and things like that. People were always going on about how you had to have some fun in your life, how you had to have adventures. But Easter had never wanted to be anywhere else but right here on Free Creek. She didn't feel an empty place inside herself because she had barely ventured out of these hills. She did, however, feel strange because she did not share the desires that the rest of the world seemed to have. She had never studied movie magazines and wished to be an actress, had never envied people on television. She thought about the people who drove through this county or flew by on the new highway without even realizing there was a whole town beyond the mountains on either side of them. If they saw this place, if they drove by Free Creek and saw her house with her sitting on the porch while she broke beans and her husband sat there drinking his beer, she knew what they would think. They would consider these people on the porch and wonder how they stood living such little lives stuck in a small town where nothing ever happened. A place where the stores closed at dusk and nobody famous ever came to speak or sing in a concert hall. A place where nobody important in their eyes had ever been born or lived. They would feel sorry for the people on the porch and the smallness of their existences, and be thankful that they themselves lived in places where there were fancy restaurants and tall buildings and jobs you had to get dressed up for. But her life did not feel little at all to her. And so I think, as soon as when I first became published and went out on tours and things of that nature, I was prepared for stereotypes, that people would have. But I think the thing that I was surprised by was how many people would say to me, "Oh, things must be so simple where you're from." And I would always be, "No, things are very complicated." And people have very complicated, busy lives. And, I mean, I grew up in a town of about 500 people. I was never, ever bored, ever. And I never wanted to leave. There's this escape narrative about the place. Now, at a certain point, I felt like I had to leave, as the culture became more politically charged and things like that. But I never wanted to. And I live in Lexington now, about an hour and a half from where I grew up, and in a city. But I'm always homesick, and I'm always aware of how complicated rural lives are and working class lives are and things like that. There's nothing simple about it.
So I asked you earlier about where you see hurt in your communities. I'm curious about the places where you're seeing people stand up and do hopeful
Mm,
things. Are there folks in particular you want us to know about, either in actual people or places where you're
yeah.
seeing signs of some hope?
Well, one of the most moving things I've ever witnessed, I think, was when Breonna Taylor was killed, and people were in the streets protesting night after night after night. I think they protested about 18 nights in a row in Lexington alone, where I was living at the time. But then you started seeing this happen all over rural Kentucky too. Breonna Taylor was a Kentuckian, you know, and I think that just really spoke to a lot of people in Kentucky to just think she was Kentuckian like me. And so I saw people in the little town that I grew up in, which when I was growing up there, it was still considered a sundown town. That is a town where black people are known to not be welcomed after dark. And that's something that people in my hometown have, been actively trying to change for decades. Of course, that doesn't mean in any way that racism is cured, or I don't mean to suggest that in any way. What I do mean to say is that there are people who want that to change, and they're working toward that change. And so to see people in my little hometown, which had been known all across the South as such a racist place, to be out in the streets marching for Breonna Taylor, it was really moving to see. And now, just the other day, there was a group of young people in my hometown who had a little pride rally. There were just about 12 of them, I think. And, they're just out there with their pride flags and their signs that are affirming people's lives and just saying, I love you, and a really positive thing. And then a man comes up and pulls a gun on them, and cusses them out and talks terribly to them. Of course, in the news, all the focus is on that man, and it should be. It should be known that somebody is, pulling a gun on peaceful protesters. But I also want people to remember that there were 12 people out there who were holding those signs just to be loving forces. So little things like that give me a lot of hope. I mean, I still think it's difficult for a lot of people to be out in the streets of Knoxville or Louisville or Birmingham or Atlanta to, say, I'm out here as an ally or I'm out here as an LGBTQ person. But I think it's a whole other thing to do that in a small little town in Eastern Kentucky or East Tennessee or rural America. So I just have so much respect for that, and it also just gives me so much hope because that could not have happened when I was 21 years old, like these people who are out there doing it now. Well, I mean,
Sure.
we knew we couldn't do that.
You wrote an essay, a piece for the New York Times years ago that I've given to a lot of people about the art of being
Hmm.
still. I'm just aware that thinking about the folks who are listening to us today, who are committed to rural communities, who are activists, who are doing social justice work, always the awareness of the ability to burn
Yes,
out,
Lord,
right?
yes.
You burn away. So I'm curious for you as a writer and as an artist, that need for stillness, that need for solitude as a way of fostering community, fostering creativity. Can you say a little bit about that to these folks, maybe who are, again, have many, many things that they're trying to
Mhm.
push back against right now, to think about how solitude and stillness might be some kind of medicine?
Well, I think, I, I had a novel that came out last year called Lark Ascending, and sort of one of a mantra that runs throughout that book is that to survive, you have to keep going, but also to survive, you have to sometimes be still. And so the solution there is that you have to strike a balance of you have to keep going, but you also have to take care of yourself. I always think about that thing that they tell you on an airplane. If you're traveling with somebody else and the mask drop, you have to put the mask on yourself before you can take care of the other person who's with you. It's the same thing if you're a part of social justice movement. You are out there because you want to take care of other people or you want to take care of the land. you're fighting for the rights of people or the land or what have you. But you also have to take care of yourself in order to do that. And sometimes I think that we sort of think that it's selfish to take some time for ourselves, but you have to do it. It's or you'll just, yeah, you'll just fizzle out. I I was writing a lot about the environment, and um, it was in all my novels and my short stories and my poetry and all that. But then in 2005, Wendell Berry called me, and he said, "You know, I love what you wrote in The Cold Tattoo about the land and all this, but you're not out there doing anything about it. You need to be speaking up. And if you're willing to do that, I would like for you to go with me, and we'll do this." And well, first of all, if Wendell Berry asks you to do something, you're going to do it, or at least I am. I I was just like, Wendell Berry, uh, you know, called me. That's all I was thinking at first. But anyway, so I did. I went with him on some, anti-mountaintop removal things. And so then I just became so passionate about it. Wendell was correct in that it was really important for me to do that because I was from a coal mining family. And I understood the complexities of being from a coal mining family, but also witnessing this devastation that was taking place. And so I could speak to the complexities of that. I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 years later, Wendell pulled me aside and he said, "You're doing great work, but you need to slow down some." And so again, I learned, two really important lessons from him: get to work and be still. And so I did have to sort of pull back for a while and, realize I'm burning out here. It will overtake your life if you're not careful. So, and then you won't be of any use to anybody or the land.
Um, when I was in the Baptist seminary in Louisville in the late 80s and early 90s, I think everybody that I knew that I admired, they were reading Wendell's novels or his poetry or his essays. And for me, it was his novels that first really allowed me to bless my own roots as a rural person from a small town. You mentioned The Color Purple. Were there other books that allowed you to really kind of bless your roots as a rural person? Was there a writer or a story or a novel
Oh, yeah.
that helped you?
So many. I mean, the first one was Lee Smith, her book, Black Mountain Breakdown. I read that when I was in ninth grade, and it was the first time that I saw my people in a novel. They were not only were they going to the places we went, Cumberland Gap or Pikeville or Knoxville or Johnson City or whatever, but they were also eating soup beans and cornbread, and they were saying "I reckon," and it was just the world that I knew, and I didn't know we could write about us. I thought you had to write about New York City or Los Angeles or whatever. That's what the culture teaches you mostly. Um, then Dorothy Allison, she was writing about, sort of the rough people that I grew up with, the harder parts of that sort of life. Of course, Wendell's Jayber Crow is, I think, Wendell Berry's best novel. It's one of the most underrated novels in American literature. And it's underrated because it is so rural, and rural literature is always underrated. I already mentioned The Color Purple, which is such a rural celebration as well. And and that's especially important because so many people always they don't think black people exist in rural areas in rural America. And here she is, presenting this incredible black rural story. Marilyn Robinson, you know, just the complexity of her rural and small town characters is so beautiful. That whole quartet of books is wonderful. Willa Cather is my touchstone. I don't think you can, if anybody's interested in rural writing, you have to read Willa Cather. And I didn't read her until pretty late. I was in my early 30s before I read her. Thomas Hardy, always. I have some others sitting here. Louise Erdrich. Um, and a recent favorite of mine that I want to recommend is Zori by Laird Hunt. It's just one of the most beautiful novels. It's set in Indiana. It's a celebration of rural life. and it's about the extraordinary nature of everyday life, which is something that really interests me. I think that's where the most interesting stories always are, just in everyday, ordinary people's lives. Shakespeare said that the best stories happen in the bedroom. And I think what he meant by that was they happen in the kitchen, on the
Yeah.
porch, in the dining room, it's just people's lives.
That's a great list, and I wrote several of those down, especially Zori. So, 2 years from now, if you and I are talking again and you're passing the mantle of poet laureate onto somebody else in Kentucky, what for you are you feeling called to do right now with this responsibility and this
Hmm.
call?
Well, I can tell you a little bit about my platform that I'm getting together. And, you become poet laureate at the end of the school term, so it sort of gives you the summer to get it all together so that when the school term comes in, you'll have it ready to go. Because I think a lot of it should serve young people. But what the main thing I really want to do as poet laureate is, growing up, I was always around old people, not only older people, but really old people. And that was so foundational for me. And so, one thing that I'm implementing is a program where I go into classrooms across the state and I work with students, teach them how to take oral histories, teach them how to write like a sort of magazine style feature. And so then I'm going to encourage them to find the older people in their families and their communities, take an oral history for them, write an introduction, and then we'll have probably a website where all those will be accessible, where young people are talking to old people. It's just a way to, for them to have that foundation that so many of us have of being around older people. So that's one of the main ones that I'm excited about. I'm also doing a series of conversations of myself and other writers where we're doing writing lessons. So like one might be on sense of place, one might be on characterization, one might be on plot, and each one of them will be people will be able to download those. So it's sort of like a podcast, but it's more like downloadable writing lessons. So teachers can use them, but also just somebody who's interested in writing, creative writing, can download them. Those are two of the main ones. I'm also starting to work with the tourism uh, cabinet. I have been to Ireland many times. One thing I love about Ireland is the way it honors its writers. You go to a town and you know what writer is from there. And so I want, if you go to Carlisle, Kentucky, you should know that Barbara Kingsolver is from there. So I want to implement ways to make that more part of our, road signage and just things like that.
With all that you're doing right now, are you able to work on anything, any new writing, any new things coming out?
I just put together a short story collection of stories of mine that have been published over about the last 20 years. Most of the stories that are in it are more recent, but there are a few older ones. So that has just been turned in, and I hope it'll be published. Um, and I'm working on a new novel in my head. I usually work on a novel in my mind for about a year before I ever write anything. I like to think a lot about it, um, so that I come to the page, ready for it to just pour out of me. The most terrifying thing for me is to come to a blank screen or a blank page and just sit there. If that ever happens, I just freak out and then I never can write anything. So I have to come loaded for bear.
Yeah, I think for me, at some point as a preacher, I'm aware that most of my sermons start in the grocery
Hmm.
store,
Yeah,
right? Because you're encountering people in the
yeah,
world, and you're like, oh, there's God showing up, or
yeah.
there's a question to wrestle with.
Yeah, the
So,
most important part of my writing process is walking. I walk, several miles every day, and while I'm walking, the story is coming to me.
Silas, thank you for this
Thank
conversation,
you.
and give my best to Jason, and I hope we get to see you all soon, either in Lexington or if y'all are down here, come see us in Knoxville.
It's always a pleasure to talk to you, and hello to Susan and to Jerry Lee. So I keep up
Well,
with Jerry Lee, the dog, on Instagram. So
he's a great dog. He's spiritual but not religious, but he's a great. And again, thank you for the work you do, and the call to write, and to write with all those wonderful LGBTQ, Appalachian, rural, Christian, faithful man. Thank you for who you
Thank
are.
you. I appreciate you, and you inspire me, so I appreciate that.